Good afternoon and welcome to the first ever Finance Committee meeting of the Sunshine Coast Regional District. It is Thursday, July 21st. It is 2 p.m. and I'd like to acknowledge that we work and live on the territory of the Sechelt and Squamish Nations. We have an agenda in front of us. Are there any additions or deletions to the agenda? Don't see anything from staff, nothing from the board. I'd look for a motion to adopt the agenda as presented. Moved and seconded. All in favor? Thank you. And I'd look for a motion to receive all the reports. Moved, seconded, all in favor? Thank you. Moving on to Annex A. This is a Sunshine Coast Regional District Q2 Corporate Financial Variance, and it's being presented by the Financial Services Manager, Brad Wing.
Thank you. All right, so this is the second quarter variance report for the 6-month period ending June 30th, 2022. We have a usual disclaimer at the beginning of this report that these are obviously unaudited numbers, and certainly with our timeline to meet this meeting, we were definitely still working away right to the last minute. So the caveat is these numbers are in progress, but they are definitely complete, and I had a look this morning, and certainly the numbers are changed a little bit, but nothing significant from what was included in the report. There's always timing differences in relation to when expenses and revenues are recorded, so those certainly play a factor in the report, and there's also a number of estimates for accruals and of expenses up to this part of the year. So just keep that in mind. The numbers can change, and obviously if anything material comes to light, we would certainly bring that to the board's attention. Moving through the report, we start with a look at revenues. One of the most revenues for the regional district are stable, but user fee revenues are one that we keep a close eye on because any variances there can certainly lead to deficits. For the functions that we look at, all are showing favorable variances with the exception of recreation, community recreation facilities and community parks. For community recreation, what we're seeing there is still a recovery from the pandemic in terms of users and annual pass holders and that sort of thing. Those numbers are trending upwards, and we're certainly hopeful that fall registration programs will see a return to more normal users in that area. There's also a seasonality factor there with the arena operations that plays a factor. That unfavorable variance there of $125,000 is being offset by lower expenditures with obviously challenges with staffing and reduced facility hours. We're seeing lower expenses that are offsetting that side. So overall, the function or the service is still in a $67,000 surplus position, but it's something that we're going to have to watch closely as we move through the year. For parks, that again, that's actually more in relation to Catherine Lake and the change in the service delivery there. So we'll be addressing that through the 2023 budget. However, that service is in a sound financial position at this point in time, so not a concern. On a line item basis, we look at our major expense lines. Salaries and wages is showing a $1.07 million favorable variance at this point. That seems to align with previous years and is generally a result of temporary vacancies and also newly approved positions that have yet to be filled. Operating expenses are showing a $728,000 favorable variance. That again is trending similar to previous years. We are noticing a few line items, most notably fuel and materials and supplies, which are being impacted by market conditions and inflation right now. So we're taking a really good look at the base budget, reviewing that in advance of the 2023 budget process to see where we can look at reallocating from other line items that may be under. At this point in time, those variances aren't creating, a bottom line variance for any services. However, as we move through the year and inflation trends continue the way they are, we'll see how things look towards the third quarter. Overall, the regional district is in a $2.4 million surplus position. That's a consolidated number for all services. Certainly the majority of services are in a surplus. There are 11 services that are in a deficit position of $1,000 or more. As of June 30th, most of those are minor, and we anticipate they will be mitigated through to year end. However, there are wastewater plants, rural planning, and joint use community schools, which are more significant deficits for those services and will most likely lead to deficits at year end. With that, I'll take any questions you may have.
Thank you. Directors? Questions or comments? And this could be on the report or on the attachment with each of the areas. Director Lee?
Yes, the rural planning is legal expenses, which I suspect are ongoing. We have sufficient reserves to cover all this if it does happen. Is that a safe assumption?
I'm not sure. This was a timing issue with some legal expenditures that were not caught as part of year end that have been put into 2021. So we have likely some reserves, but again, I don't know off the top of my head what the uncommitted balance is, but likely in third quarter we'll provide more information to that effect as far as how we would mitigate any of those, especially as we were trending closer to year end.
Yes, I think the reason I was asking is once you're committed to something like that, you're not going to stop. So it might be carrying through the whole year yet, but I guess we'll figure that out by the third quarter, right? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Director McMahon?
Yeah, just a general information question. So if we've got a position that we have budgeted and we're showing a surplus because we haven't filled it, I guess that's not a real surplus. It's comparison to budget. So it just disappears, or does it go somewhere as a credit on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, so when we look at the line item variances, they are just that certain line, and they may be offset by, favorable or unfavorable variances in other lines. At year end, when we produce the year end surplus deficit report, that is a consolidated picture for the entire service, and any resulting surplus from wages would flow through to the automatic transfer to reserves at year end. Yep.
Follow up on that, or you're good? Okay. Any other questions on the report? I don't see any other questions. So we'll move on to Annex B. Annex B is, sorry, yeah. Oh, that's attachment B, sorry. Annex B in my package. Annex B is the Sunshine Coast Regional District debt as of June 30th, 2022. And this will be over to Tina. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So this particular report is provided a couple of times a year and provides a picture of the regional district's position as well as member municipal debt. So included in this particular report, there is some new information, and that is based on market conditions for interest rates. So we've provided a lot more detail and background associated with the type of debts that are available to local governments and where we're at with some of the types of interest rates for various types of instruments, such as our equipment financing, our short-term borrowing, as well as our long-term borrowing. As you may recall, we had over $23 million worth of new debt budgeted for the regional district, and that is significantly, that's over double what we currently have in our debt schedule, which is included on page 110 of your agenda, which provides sort of a table of where we're at. So this is quite material. It could have significant implications to the regional district, especially depending on when we actually do security issuing for those particular long-term instruments for Church Road, as well as our water treatment plant being the two. The other ones are more short-term in nature. So what we have on the books are the more significant ones, which would be the Cooper's Green Hall replacement. And of course, we understand there's changing conditions for that particular project, as well as the landfill mitigation that we did and we closed off this year. So we just currently issued that particular instrument, which is short term, and that was, I think, upwards to almost 1.6 million that's approved for that. So again, just wanted to make sure that the board understood and the public understood what this means, and we'll update these figures as the financial plan, the draft financial plan for 2023-2027 gets approved. So I'll take any questions if there are any. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Directors, any questions? Director McCann?
Just a comment. We certainly do get very favorable rates through MFA, and I had a good time telling the Chamber of Commerce what our borrowing rates were. They were very envious, and I pointed out what a good value they're getting for their taxes. So there.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, I think we're all watching with interest as rates are changing. And it'll be interesting to see where these come out at the end when we actually borrow that. Really would be nice to get that $6 million grant for the water meters. And yes. We do talk to our MP and our MLA, and we push as much as we can. Any other questions or comments on this report? Seeing none, let's move on to item number 4, Annex C, Gas Tax Community Works Fund Update. And back over to you.
Thank you, Chair. So this particular report is to provide an update on the Community Works Gas Tax Fund. So as the last report indicated, there's been a little bit of rebranding with the gas tax, where it's more Canada Build Fund. But the Community Works stream is still intact. And so this particular agreement does come up at the end of 2024. And so again, as UBCM keeps indicating, they are looking for the regional district and local governments to look to projects to commit these particular funds. We did have significant commitment as part of the 2022 budget for mains replacements for Area A. However, we do have significant amount in some of the rural areas, most notable. I know that with work with the active transportation, these are obviously going to be addressed as part of the 2023 budget. But again, there may be some other opportunities. There has been past directives for staff to come back to look to pooled with our member municipalities. And again, we continue to be mindful of that. And again, most recently, the Reed Road active transportation was something that we couldn't quite jump on due to timing constraints. So again, always staff are always mindful of that. So included in 116 is a summary of the commitments, and again, these will be considered as part of funding options for the 2023 budget proposals as well. Take any questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you. Directors? Director McMahon.
Yes. As a board, I think we need to look at our gas tax allocation policy. I have not read it closely, but there's a lot of questions about how we would fairly fund shared services, and even like take fire hall number 2 as an example. It's in my area, but it's part of a shared service. So, you know, could we have funded the roof out of gas tax? Don't know. Do we have an actual plan going forward on how we're going to work with Modi on active transportation? Or is that's kind of not your department, but...
How about if I address that one? I think out of some of the meetings that we've had, particularly with Modi, we've requested that one of our EAs, like, look at Modi and where those projects are approved. And then at UBCM, we're looking at meeting with those people to say, here's what we've got. You know, we have some funds. We need to be in on the planning and the approval process around this so that we can contribute some of these funds to some joint projects. So I know she's doing the research right now to find that, and I think the deadline for requesting the meetings is in August sometime. So she'll be putting, you know, coming back to us with that information, and we can make some requests for some meetings. Because that's, I mean, it's not our staff, it's, we need to get in with Modi on those kinds of things.
And their timelines can be very long.
Totally,
I see that
totally.
GM
Gagnon.
is here.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for that. I think that is absolutely an important part of the active transportation initiative is the work that you guys do from a governance perspective and an advocacy perspective. I just wanted to suggest that we are in conversations with Modi around trying to be very clear on what Modi defines as active transportation and what we would define as active transportation, because without that alignment, obviously that needs to be primary, because we don't want to be building something that Modi doesn't consider to be active transportation, and then we're stuck with infrastructure that nobody seems to want to own. So we are in conversation with them. The other thing that we are doing is you have in the past provided some direction as well as board resolution around segments of what you consider active transportation infrastructure that you would like to see reviewed. And so we are prioritizing that, taking a look at it. We have drafted some considerations for 2023 in the budget, but that will also go hand in hand with these ongoing conversations that we're having with Modi. So we are looking into it and trying to get a better understanding of how to plan. And the work that you will do from an advocacy perspective is also very valuable. And lastly, I'll add that we are actively engaged with TRAC as well as some other regional districts in having a conversation around successes and challenges related to ATI. And that meeting is planned for the fall. So I'm looking forward to that and learning further on how we can plan. So thank you.
Thank you. So clarity on this, when, and this will be to Tina, when do we need to have committed these funds, not spent them, but when do we have to have committed them? Because I think UBCM has actually put in a deadline for information. Is that correct?
I think they're looking to definitely have a plan that you have those funds. So very similar to the COVID restart funds where you actually have a schedule. It's not as restrictive as that I have yet have received, but they are looking before the next agreement that there is funding commitment for this particular pot of money. So from a timing perspective, 2023 looking into the 2024 year.
Thank you. Director Lee.
I'm more interested in getting more money to spend. Have we got all of our 2022 allocation in place now? And will we get 2023 prior to budget time so we can allocate the 2023?
So in the particular schedule on page 116, it does show the most recent updates and what's projected. So I don't know if we've received, typically we receive the first installment in July and then the second one in November for 2022. So included in here is what those anticipated amounts will be. And then what we will do as part of budget is include what the 2023, we already kind of know what we're going to receive for 2023. They don't, we've also had expedited payments as part of the pandemic. So we got top-ups as well. So those are reflected in there from last year, so.
Thank you.
Director McMahon?
Yes, so I have to say that I kind of feel like I have a pot of money over here and a pot of needs here, but the criteria for spending the money does not necessarily meet the needs that we have, particularly in terms of climate change mitigation and adaptation. Is there any hope of UBCM modifying their rules to make it possible for us to spend money on some urgent problems that we have that don't fit their, pipes and airports sort of criteria?
So one of the key factors or main thrust of the gas tax was actually to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's just that the caveat is that it needs to lead eventually to a capital asset, so some type of infrastructure. So in essence, it depends what type of climate adaptation project we were looking at. If it doesn't materialize into a capital asset, then no, the current funding structure doesn't allow for that. There may be some caveats to it, but we'd have to be very clearly define what the scope is before we could bring that to UBCM. Again, it's not UBCM that decides the framework. They definitely can advocate on behalf of local governments of British Columbia. However, this is a federal agreement and it's a federal program that's administered through UBCM. So again, as they start to negotiate the new agreement, we are seeing, especially with the new strategic priorities funds, that particular application definitely had a little bit more relaxing on some of the terms and conditions, but I think that's not something I have directly heard, but most certainly would be beneficial for local government as that becomes more of a priority both for province, local government, I mean the world really.
So I almost see a request inside of that. Director McMahon and Director Lee, and Director Hiltz, actually, all of you, have a lot of money sitting there that you need to come up with some plans for, but don't really know what kinds of projects they could go towards inside of the criteria. I'm wondering if it's possible to get more information to the directors. I know you've given it to us in the past, but I think we're really becoming aware that we're going to probably have to look outside of what we've typically done. So we want to look at what that criteria is and the categories to see if there are projects that we've become aware of now over the years that we could potentially use those funds for. And then those could come back to staff potentially for budget proposals or something. Yeah, go ahead.
So staff are already in the midst of preparing for the 2023 budget. And so we had the gas tax workshop with UBCM and we did identify several projects. I know there are several projects that are in feasibility stages right now that are most certainly with the eye that eventually gas tax may be a source of funding for those particular projects. Again, as GM Gagnon identified, the active transportation that's being worked on. So it's to say that you will for sure see some movement on this particular, there will be some asks that are definitely in line with current plans, so things that are already on the docket. So again, the climate and energy, so some of the targets, the work that Raf and his team are doing, again, is evolving. And so with that, identifying where we can corporately reduce greenhouse gas and what those projects might look like. So there's a lot of things, I guess I'm saying, that's a work in progress. And so they will be coming up in the next, I would say, 6 to 8 months, definitely 6 months. So you'll probably see a lot of that as part of the 2023 budget process, which is the next board. But most certainly, we're very well aware of this pot of funds. We're very well aware of a lot of the needs. So if there were things that were not, they were new projects that weren't really already in the stream of feasibility or scoping right now, the first initial design phase, for instance, for the Half Moon Bay Fire Hall is one of the projects that I can think of, then that would be new information. So we wouldn't be looking necessarily if someone had a different idea or the board had a board member had a different idea.
Okay, Director McMahon?
Yeah, I still have quite a few questions that it'd be helpful to have in a report at some point. The clarification of who sets the criteria, I'm fairly sure that we inquired through our MP's office, and that office told us that the decision was made at the UBCM level, not by the feds, but UBCM keeps telling us it's the federal government. So I really would like to know who exactly here is setting the policy. I'd like to know where they are in terms of considering natural assets, because I do know that there are conversations going on about that, but I'd kind of like to know where they're at and how long it's going to take them to make up their minds. Then there's the other thing that I find kind of difficult. For instance, the town I know are considering some stormwater projects that would materially benefit my area by potentially diverting a lot of stormwater out of Chester Creek. And that's causing a lot of damage, property damage and infrastructure damage in my area, but the actual physical infrastructure that they would potentially build would actually be in the town. So under the current rules, I don't think we can contribute, but yeah, you know, that's one of those gray areas. Shared projects, because we've got so much, you know, I'm so close to the town, and it's really important that we work together and get more traction on projects that will benefit all of us.
Did you want to comment on any of that?
Well, I can perhaps provide some insight into what that would look like. I mean, we don't have a stormwater service. So again, it's a region, that would be the first hurdle to be able to do that, to be able to filter funds through that. It's not a regional district asset, which is one of the conditions. So again, so there's a couple of things that in the one example would be a challenge. And based on most grants, it does have to be sort of under the purview of the grantor from the asset perspective. So that would be a challenge. As far as the advocacy piece, most certainly that's the board's prerogative through to UBCM. UBCM's coming up, so I don't know if there's been any calls for comments. I'm not aware of any, but sometimes in the past they have most certainly, when they're ready to do that work, that preliminary work maybe is started, they would most certainly welcome any feedback that any of the local governments would provide them. The back end from a shared service has already been a pass motion to staff to bring back, and we have actually brought options back for that. So we are mindful of those types of things. So another project out there is, what are we going to do with Landfill 2.0 and all of our solid waste respective projects that we have on the go? That's something that most certainly would be contemplated from a sharing of resources or alternative sources of funding. So
I'm wondering if directors would like to know what some of the projects are that staff are looking at potentially for the upcoming budget. You know, just basically to see, are they aligned with what you have, or are there others, you know, that you've come up with Because if we wait until those come forward, there's probably no time to get them into a budget. It's up to you. Dr. Ties?
Yeah, I think so. As Roberts Creek goes, the only thing I could think of was maybe some parks-related things, or sprockets contributing to that as a pump track or something like that. That would be the only thing that I could think of apart from what we had always sidelined it for, which is active transportation. But yeah, happy to look at the list.
Thank you. Director Pratt?
I think it might be more prudent if the directors suggest to staff things that are on their list and staff can say whether or not they're on theirs, rather than the other way around. I will say for Area B, I know the community would like to see some more active transportation, of course. However, there's also, with that funding, with the change with Cooper's Green, you know, and I know there's the stacking rule, but if there's any of that fund that can be used for Cooper's Green, you know, as we move forward, I'm loath to allocate anything else from the until there's until everything else is figured around Cooper's Green. So those are my thoughts for Area B.
Thank you. Director Ties?
Yeah, I just thought of the separate multi-use trail parallel to the highway might be easier to administer and refurbish than other shoulders that have sort of joint jurisdiction with MOTI, and there's some serious resurfacing that needs to be done, plus the ditch that's has to be replaced. So I know that staff is working with MOTI on that, but I think the first section, especially from Roberts Creek Road all the way to Lockyer, is gotten to the point that I don't want to take my road bike on it anymore because I don't want my road bike to break. So resurfacing that might be something that we could certainly. I think that would be something that could sort of make the active transportation folks happy, as well as make it easier for us to accomplish some funding goals on the gas tax funds. Yeah, so I'd like to see that in the budget.
All right, so Director Pratt was indicating that if there are projects that you may have in your area and you want to find out, are they included, are they something that could be included, that you could put those down and submit them to staff? Staff okay with that?
It would depend in what format they came, I suppose. We would look at this as probably part of the pre-budget process later on. So if it was something where staff are being directed to take early action, then that wouldn't really fit with when we would do this. But if all we're doing is compiling a potential list of projects that may be of interest that could be considered as part of that process, then that would probably be fine.
I think what I'm hearing from directors is they are aware of projects in their area that could be potentially covered off using gas tax funds. We know that staff are working on potential projects, but we don't have any communication between the two. So how do we facilitate that communication so that, directors are aware that yes, these funds are being used for projects, and that their projects that they have come up with are potentially being considered. And we don't care what that looks like. How do we make that happen?
If we seem to be looking at each other funny, it's because we don't actually have an existing process. So this would require the development of some type of process for this.
We're talking a conversation, maybe. That's
which,
it.
which is pretty easy to
Yeah,
facilitate.
yeah, maybe we can look at facilitating something around that, just so that there's some communication going back and forth. You know, because you might actually be doing the projects that are considered, but we don't know that.
Right now, we have, I would say, these conversations occur on a very ad hoc basis.
Yes. Okay.
Like, say, I got an idea type of conversation. So if what we're looking for is to create an opportunity to share this information, then that can probably
Okay.
easily be accomplished.
We'll take it offline and we'll make it happen. Okay, sounds good. Anything else about this report? I don't see anything further. Let's move on to the financial planning policy revised draft. Annex D. And Ms. Perot, over to you.
Thank you. So this particular policy was brought forward last month, and staff were sent back to make some amendments. They have been included in the draft and are there for your consideration and adoption of the policy.
Directors? Director McMahon, then Director Pratt.
The draft looks good to me. Yeah, no, I remember the changes. They seem to be in there, so I'm willing to move the recommendations on page 117.
Thank you. Is there a seconder for that recommendation? And this would then have to come to board for actual approval. Yep, seconded. All right, further discussion? Director Pratt?
I had, there's just a couple of questions and edits that I have, and I will admit, and full disclosure, it came, I had a very, I had a constituent come and take a really close eye at both of these draft policies and with keen interest. So on page 122, under 4.3 planning cycle, B, it says the 5-year financial plan will reflect the general operating and capital budgets and will be updated on an annual basis for the preceding 5 years. Should that not say following 5 years?
She's saying proceeding instead of preceding.
And yeah.
Okay. Yeah, good catch.
Okay. And then there was another note or question from my constituent about our policy addresses reserve funds and borrowing, but makes no mention of grants. Should we be referencing grants, or at least with a statement that says that grants will be pursued aggressively when available from senior governments, or something to that effect? Or do we have another policy that addresses grant applications?
Thank you, Chair. So as mentioned as part of the initial presentation of this particular policy was that we have other related policies such as the financial sustainability policy, which identifies other sources of revenues. So it isn't just that we pursue other sources of grants. That is another way. But sometimes it may mean donations, it may mean amenities, contributions, which although non-binding, definitely there is history of us pursuing those quite, we also have development cost charges. So there's many means. So that is identified in the financial sustainability policy. And again, we didn't want to include information that was in the financial sustainability policy and be redundant in another policy. This one is more related to financial planning, of which grants and those other sources of funding are not something you can rely on. So from a financial planning perspective, it's not a best practice.
Okay, thank you for that clarity, CFO. And then just one other comment, if I may, regarding regarding the establishment of new services. Where should we change that to maybe, or have a reference to expansion of existing services as well? Or because we also talk about where is it now? Sorry. The service withdrawal, but should we also talk about an expansion of service, does that need to be addressed here, or is that addressed in a different policy as well?
Indirectly, most certainly identified in the financial sustainability, which is when a significant expansion of service be considered, that we understand the full life cycle. So it's also very difficult to measure what is the trigger, and we don't have that clearly defined as to what an expansion of service means. For a very small service, it may be something very small as a major expansion of service to those local ratepayers. So we don't have that clearly defined, but most certainly a business case needs to be provided and cost alternatives. So the reason why it's in this particular policy is because it wasn't identified anywhere else, and it definitely is something that was not clearly understood both from the board and the public, and even from staff's perspective, is to what is the method when we contemplate these. So when we expand service, I think that we'd have to be mindful as to what that wording is. And again, it is in the financial sustainability policy, and it's embedded in a lot of your financial planning process, your budget process. So each budget proposal has to be identified as to whether it's service enhancement, and expansion of service. So I think, again, that's what some of the options you'll see in staff reports as well. So I guess I would ask back, what is the purpose, or what is the problem you're trying to solve as far as the policy goes in identifying expansion of service?
I think it's just clarity around that, but if it's addressed in another policy, then I'm okay with that, and I will point my constituent to those so as well. But I thought you brought forward great questions that I'm like, these are good ones to contemplate as we're talking about this. So thank you.
Thank you. Director Hiltz?
Thanks, Chair. The fiscal year being January 1st to December 31st. It's not in here. Oh, okay. So there's often confusion between the provincial government and local government, and it's well known if you're inside this building that it runs from January 1st to December 31st. But I'm just, because it's in our audit reports and all this kind of stuff, but would it be a definition? Do you need to define fiscal year for the public as a, I'm not sure if it's helpful or not.
We could.
So you'd put that in as a definition, is what you're saying? So fiscal year, and then indicate January 1st to December 31st? Probably staff. Or would it be under policy?
Or planning cycle. I couldn't
Or
decide
planning cycle?
or definitions, but because mic on. Sorry. Yeah, a year is mentioned and without context, so it's either in the planning cycle or in the definitions, and you've got the 5-year financial plan, so it seems to be kind of a definition sort of a thing, but.
Yes, that's on page 122 is the planning cycle.
Oh, yeah,
It
planning
says-
cycle is 122, definitions, it might be cleaner, but I'm just bringing it up because people might ask. People ask me. Thanks.
No, good point. I mean, considering we are dealing with Modi, who has a different one. School board, right? Where would you suggest we put something like that? Tina?
So what I was scanning very quickly, because I don't have Control F, exam paper, as to whether or not we actually have fiscal year in the policy, because if we don't, then we would probably define that in the 5-year financial plan, and we'd include it in there. But we definitely can. I don't think it has to come back, but we will incorporate that, so we can make a motion that staff include in the policy as appropriate that the SCRD's fiscal cycle is from January 1st to December 31st is a calendar year. And so we'll find the most appropriate place to make sure it's consistent and doesn't create some anomaly in the policy.
So just a motion to include fiscal year in the policy.
You'd like to make that recommendation?
Yes, please.
Is there a seconder for the recommendation?
Point of order, don't we have a motion already on the floor?
Oh, we do? Sorry, yes, we do. Okay, yep, we'll have to amend the motion that's on the floor.
Yes, amending the motion on the floor by adding fiscal policy into the fiscal year into the policy.
All right, is there a seconder for the amendment? Seconded, thank you. Any other comments or questions about the amendment? All those in favor, oh, go ahead, Director McBain.
Just a question. Do we set our own fiscal year, or does the province tell us what our fiscal year is?
And is that in legislation then?
Yes.
So the province sets it's in legislation, the province sets it. Okay. Okay, so are you indicating that given it's legislatively set for us, we may not need to put it in there? Go ahead.
Well, if it's a definition, it's there for information to be helpful. I don't think we're implying that we are setting this as a policy.
All right, so there's an amendment on the floor to include fiscal year into the policy. All those in favor? Thank you. Any other amendments before we? There is the other one, the preceding versus proceeding. Is that a correction or do we need to amend it?
To include the fiscal year? Oh, yes, that's a correction. So, yes, thank you.
So we'll need a motion for that one? Okay. Would you like to make that motion? Director Pratt, go ahead.
That the word preceding be changed to proceeding?
Is there a seconder for the recommendation? Thank you. So that's another amendment. All those in favor of that amendment? Thank you. All right, any others before we move this forward? Director Hiltz, did you have anything further? Anybody else? Anything? All right, so we have a motion with two amendments. So the motion that was on the floor, would you like, Tara, do you want to read it rather than me just going back to this? Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. And that the financial planning policy be approved as amended as follows. Replace instances of preceding with proceeding in section 4.3 planning cycle and add definition of fiscal year as January 1 to December 31.
Thank you. All right, all those in favor? Thank you very much. Moving on to Annex E, number 6, Asset Management Policy Draft. And this is Mr. Doyle, is he joining us? You're here? All right, over to Tina. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So again, this was a few minor edits from the previous version, which has been updated here. Manager Doyle is on some well-deserved vacation days today and tomorrow, so I can take any questions, hopefully, that you might have.
Thank you. Directors, any questions or comments? Director Pratt.
Once again, from my very knowledgeable constituent, I had a couple of comments/questions. One is if we should consider adding a definition of expected life cycle for an asset or full life cycle, if we should add that into our definitions.
With the goal of and what is envisioned by putting that definition in there. And the reason why I ask is because one of the things we're running on is that expected useful life is just that, it's the expected. And so definitely based on condition, the preventative maintenance cycles, it doesn't always materialize. So that's why the plans are always reviewed. So an expected useful life in one particular iteration may not be the same iteration the next year, and hence why we continue to review them. So binding us to the expected useful life, I don't think I would advocate for, because definitely it has changed. And again, you'll be seeing some reports where that is definitely our current situation. And it's happened with some of the community recreation facilities where we expected something to last 20 and it only lasted 15 or 12.
Yeah. So this wouldn't be an actual like number or anything like that. It's just how that term is, you know, what we mean by that term. Just spelling it out in there. That's the intent of my understanding of this.
So it sounds like what you're saying is if we're talking in a report or something about estimated life of a item of whatever, that there's
Yep.
an understanding of what that actually means.
Yeah.
It's just an
With,
estimate.
yeah, and it's part of the definition. It can be, you know, it can be spelled out that that it can change from time. It can change based on new information or damage, et cetera, or something like that. It's a thought. So just putting it out there, whether or not that clarity is needed within this policy.
Tina?
Just to clarify, it was expected useful life and not estimated useful life. Both terms were mentioned, so I just want to make sure we're
Expected life for an asset and or full life cycle.
They are two different things, and I think she's looking for both definitions. And the full life cycle, I think, is something that we've been talking about here, and, you know, with staff, in that when something comes to us for approval, we're actually looking for the cost over the life of it. So what is it going to cost us next year for maintenance or fees or whatever? And I think that's something that we do talk about at the board, and it isn't defined in here. Expected life is, again, something else that ties into that. Okay. So in as definitions, that would be, yeah, okay.
they're in the policy.
Okay, Director Pratt?
That's it on that one. The other one was just also from my constituent. I had a great one look through everything with a fine-tooth comb, so I'm very grateful. A suggestion that we have a statement about our planning period be used to reviewing proposed short-term investments with consideration to full life cycle impacts, because this would allow for better decisions to be made. And the suggestion that the 10 to 15-year planning period should be updated annually. And we already have a 5-year financial plan, so the idea of a longer time frame is already there. So that's just, it's just another suggestion as well, so.
Okay, I'm not totally clear on what you're asking for there.
Like I said, it's talking about our planning, that our planning period, and this is something that's really come up with the wastewater treatment plants, as they're talking about that planning period, and talking about the life cycle, and reviewing them on maybe 10 to 15-year periods rather than looking at those full life cycle. So rather than looking the 50 years out when everything is going to be done, looking at it on a shorter but yet kind of like midterm period. The concepts come up quite a bit when we've talked about it with the wastewater treatment people. But I don't know if we directly want to have a statement about it, but it's something that that's been suggested as well.
Thank you. Do you want to weigh in on that one at all? I mean, first off, for me, what comes up is every different asset's going to be different.
Yeah.
So how would you reflect that in some kind of statement? But Tina?
So from a best practice perspective, any type of life cycle costing from an accounting perspective is going to include the life cycle of the asset, and those are sometimes defined by CRA. They also will be defined by our tangible capital asset policy. So for instance, buildings have a life cycle of 40 years. And so we sometimes look at 20 to 40 year or the full life cycle of what something is expected based on things like engineering standards. So we use professional guidance on what guides us on the life cycle, not based on what a particular local service areas determined life cycle would be. We try to look at it holistically, and most certainly this has been the guidance as we've emerged through even recording our tangible capital assets. Is when all the infrastructure in Canada was mostly built in the 1950s and 60s, there wasn't really understanding of what was going to happen when those particular assets came to their full life, and they never really planned accordingly. And I think that is the movement of what is asset management for local government and public sector, is to ensure that we understand as local governments, because we aren't just here for 10, 15, 20 year, we are here for the life of the community. And so we want to understand what is the financial implication for the current generation, but the future generation. So that's our, I think, the board and the staff's fiduciary responsibility when being the caregivers of these particular assets and the purveyors and service delivery. So maintaining that sustainable service delivery, and that's kind of the purpose that we're trying to talk about. So from a ratepayer's perspective, that is a different factor. But when we're talking about the full life cycle of an asset, most certainly you want to understand what the full cost implication of delivering that service is. And I think ratepayers want to understand that. Now, whether or not the board or the ratepayers are willing to fund that burden, that's a different decision. But I don't think you meld the two. You still want to understand what it is. You don't want to hide under the coats, as I like to put it.
Thank you, CFO. That really helps too. So thanks.
All right, Director Lee.
Thank you, Chair. I actually was going to say I don't think it's possible to define a full life cycle impact, because these things should never have an end of life. We need water forever. We're going to continue to keep our dams up and all that kind of stuff. The best you can do is have a plan from 0 to 5, which is, let's say 0 to 5, which is short term, 0 to 20, which you can safely plan on financing. But your plan is 0 to multi-generations, which is the full life cycle. And I don't think we want to make a plan that long. It'd be pretty hard. So I don't know, maybe you need to say something about the fact that the service is going to go on forever. And asset management is something that plans to keep it going on and attempts to forecast the cost. But I'd be interested, Tina said it, but I don't know if you'd write it into the plan or into this policy, sorry.
I think we were potentially looking at adding an expected life and full life cycle as definitions.
But I don't know. If you were to give me that definition, I would say it's infinity. Is that what you want?
But it isn't. Does your vehicle run forever without any maintenance or upgrade?
Yeah, what about the water supply? Are you going to abandon the water supply?
No, but the pipes, the assets that we put in to manage that need to be maintained. They have a life cycle.
Individual components have a life cycle, yes. That's true. But then you start considering natural assets. Are you going to forecast how long the river's going to keep running? It's a pretty tough one.
Do you want to weigh in?
Well, now you have me engaged. So yes, you've already identified, yes, and that's why we look and we break down services based on its components. So we do break them down, and we do have to plan for their eventual, not just the maintenance, but their eventual replacement. And cumulatively, we look at what it is to deliver that service in a holistic manner. It's not just a start and stop, because you don't always put these things in at the same time and they don't all last at the same time. So we're definitely had that conversation with our community recreation facilities, where we have 2 newer facilities that are now aging and 2 older facilities that in the Parks and Recreation Master Plan was what is the plan for those two? Are we going to decommission them? What is going to be? So that's all part of, and then we have to bundle that into the umbrella called that particular service, whether it be, regional water, north-south Pender water, and what that means. From the natural asset perspective, right now, the public sector accounting standards is looking at how to integrate natural assets into financial statements. And so where this is at is in its infancy as far as what this would look like. But would one of the contexts be how much water from a life cycle? I think the answer is yes. That is what they're looking at, is how much from, whether it's an aquifer, look what's happening in California. When are you going to be able to continue to count on that particular natural asset to deliver the service that it's delivering to you, all things considered. So that is being factored into. And again, so, as things mature, public sector accounting standards is trying to keep up with those types of things. So the answer could be yes, one day you will have to decide when that river will run out.
All right, any other questions, comments on the policy? So I have to get back up to the top. So on page 128 is a recommendation, and then Director Pratt had 2 definitions that she would like added. So Director Pratt, would you like to make a motion?
Why, certainly, Chair Seegers. I would like to add the definitions of expected life cycle and full life cycle, please.
Okay, so you'd like a recommendation that the asset management policy be approved as amended, including expected life cycle and full life cycle definitions.
Yes, of course.
Tina?
I thought it was expected useful life.
Expected useful life, is that what it is?
Full life cycle.
I think expected useful life is a fantastic one. It's not what I had on my note, but that I like that better. Expected useful life and full life cycle.
Thank you. So that's a recommendation. Is there a seconder for the recommendation? Seconded. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? All those in favor? Thank you very much. We have no communications, no new business, no in-camera. I'd look for a motion to adjourn. Moved, seconded, all in favor? Thank you. And we have nobody in the gallery. We have no questions. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day. It looks gorgeous out there. Bye-bye.